Alright, let me sprinkle in another. It's got to be an international person. Alright, this young lady right there. Q. President Obama, the principles that we outlined I think put in place or move us in the direction of what I consider to be best practices. Which is that there is some accountability with respect to executive compensation. Now, theoretically, that should be the shareholders. But the way that too many corporations have operated for too long is that you have a CEO who basically selects his board. The board, in a fairly cozy relationship oftentimes with the executive, hires an executive compensation firm. Which, surprisingly, tends to think that it's necessary to retain the best talent to pay people $20 or $30 million a year. And we get into the kinds of habits and practices that I think have not have not served shareholders well, I think ultimately distort the decision-making of many CEOs. When I was in the United States Senate, I actually worked on a piece of legislation that would make the simple proposition that executive compensation should be subject to a shareholder vote, even if it was non-binding. So that there was transparency and accountability and perhaps a shame function that would take place. And that principle, I think, is reflected in these guidelines. What it says is that if you get shareholders involved and those shareholders are given a set of principles and best practices by which they can judge executive compensation. Then you can still have outsized rewards and success for successful business people, but it will be based on not short-term performance. Not 3-month performance, not your ability to flip quick profits off products like derivatives that don't turn out to be particularly productive to the company, but based on sustained, effective growth. And that's what's embodied in these documents. And I think that you're going to see a lot of countries try to encourage that kind of transparency and accountability. It doesn't mean the state micromanaging sneezes. Excuse me, I've been fighting. This all week. It doesn't mean that we want the state dictating salaries, we don't. I strongly believe in a free market system, and as I think people understand in America. At least, people don't resent the rich, they want to be rich. And that's good. But we want to make sure that there's mechanisms in place that holds people accountable and produces results. Okay. Got to go back to my crew. Jake Tapper. Q. And 2, your friend and ally, Prime Minister Brown. Said that the old Washington consensus is over. Today we have reached a new consensus. Is he right? And what do you think he meant by that? President Obama, in life there are no guarantees, in economics there are no guarantees. The people who thought they could provide guarantees. Many of them worked at AIG and it didn't work out so well. So there are always risks involved. I have no doubt, though, that the steps that have been taken are critical to preventing us sliding into a depression. They are bolder and more rapid than any international response that we've seen to a financial crisis in memory. And I think that they will have a concrete effect in our ability, individually, in each nation, to create jobs. Save jobs that exist, grow the economy, loosen up credit, restore trust and confidence in the financial markets. So these steps, another way of putting it is, I think the steps in the communiqué were necessary. Whether they're sufficient, we've got to wait and see. I'm actually confident, though, that given the common commitment in the United States and in the other G20 countries to act rapidly and boldly, that if we see other inklings of panic in the marketplace, or things unwinding, that this group, once again, will respond as needed. So I guess maybe just to use an analogy that was used several times in this meeting. An analogy that I've used in the past: you got a sick patient, I think we applied the right medicine. I think the patient is stabilized, there's still wounds that have to heal and there's still emergencies that could arise. But I think that you've got some pretty good care being applied. You had a second, follow-up question? Q. President Obama, oh, the Washington Consensus. Well, the Washington Consensus, as I'm sure you're aware, Jake. Is sort of a term of art about a certain set of policies surrounding globalization and the application of a cookie-cutter model to economic growth. Trade liberalization, deregulation that was popular and did help globalize and grow the economy. and was led by some of our leading economists and policy makers in Washington. I think that there's always been a spectrum of opinion about how unfettered the free market is. And along that spectrum, I think there have been some who believe in very fierce regulation and are very suspicious of globalization. And there are others who think that it's always that the market is always king. And I think what we've learned here, but if anybody had been studying history they would have understood earlier. Is that the market is the most effective mechanism for creating wealth and distributing resources to produce goods and services that history has ever known. But that it goes off the rails sometimes, that if it's completely unregulated. That if there are no thoughtful frameworks to channel the creative energy of the market, that it can end up in a very bad place. And so, in that sense, I think that we just went through a couple of decades where there was an artificial complacency about the dangers of markets going off the rails. And a crisis like this reminds us that we just have to put in some common sense rules of the road. Without throwing out the enormous benefits that globalization have brought in terms of improving living standards. Reducing the cost of goods, and bringing the world closer together. All right, I've got time for just a couple more questions. I'm going to find a journalist here. Q inaudible. Q. President Obama, all right, I'm going to call on this gentleman right here. He's been very persistent. Q. President Obama, I may choose which one I want to answer. Q. President Obama, that's always the danger of asking two questions. Q. My second question is, on behalf of the world, politics is very local, even though we've been talking about global solution. As indicated by your recent preference over American journalists and British, which is okay. How can you make sure that you will do whatever you can so that local politics will not trump or negatively affect good international economics? Thank you, Mr. President. President Obama, well, those are excellent questions. On the first question, your American counterparts will tell. I'm terrible with those little catchphrases and sound bites. So I haven't come up with anything catchy yet. But if you have any suggestions, let me know. I'll be happy to use them. In terms of local politics, look, I'm the President of the United States. I'm not the President of China, I'm not the President of Japan. I'm not the President of the other participants here. And so I have a direct responsibility to my constituents to make their lives better. That's why they put me in there. That accounts for some of the questions here, about how concretely does me being here help them find a job. Pay for their home, send their kids to college, live what we call the American dream. And I will be judged by my effectiveness in meeting their needs and concerns. but in an era of integration and interdependence, it is also my responsibility to lead America into recognizing that its interests, its fate is tied up with the larger world, that if we neglect or abandon those who are suffering in poverty, that not only are we depriving ourselves of potential opportunities for markets and economic growth, but ultimately that despair may turn to violence that turns on us. That unless we are concerned about the education of all children and not just our children, not only may we be depriving ourselves of the next great scientist who's going to find the next new energy source that saves the planet, but we also may make people around the world much more vulnerable to anti-American propaganda. So if I'm effective as America's president right now, part of that effectiveness involves providing Americans insight into how their self-interest is tied up with yours. And that's an ongoing project because it's not always obvious. And there are going to be times where short-term interests are going to differ, there's no doubt about it. And protectionism is the classic example. You can make arguments that if you can get away with protecting your markets, as long as the other folks don't protect theirs, then in the short term you may benefit. And it then becomes important not only for me to try to give people a sense of why, over the long term, that's counterproductive, but also it becomes important for me to put policies in place in the United States that provide a cushion. Provide support for those people who may suffer local dislocations because of globalization. And that's something that I think every government has to think about.